Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of the Memoirs of General Rapp. Chapter 25.
The conflagration, the sight of the ground which had been so often trodden by the Polish legions on their return from their glorious expeditions, excited fresh ardor. The troops were inspired by the force of their recollections. We dashed on in pursuit of the enemy, but the rain fell in torrents and the cold had become severe. We were now in the bogs and quagmires of Pultusk, and we were destitute both of shelter and clothing. All this, however, would have been nothing had the Russians ventured to let us come up with them. But they reached the Borysthenes and crossed the Dwina, flying and ravaging the country which they passed through. We were maintaining a racing contest rather than carrying on a war. They had now lost all unity and connection, and we abandoned the hope of coming to an engagement. The enemy, however, having gained ground by dint of speed, succeeded in rallying his forces, and he took refuge in the works which he had constructed at Drissa. But he was soon in danger of being attacked in his entrenchments and of having his retreat cut off. He did not venture to incur this double risk, and therefore fled. He would have been lost had he delayed for a few hours. All the necessary arrangements were made for attacking his flank and intercepting him. He owed his safety to a coup de main. Some of our advanced corps, not being sufficiently vigilant, were surprised by Wittgenstein. Napoleon concluded that the Russians were marching upon us and halted his columns. This delay saved them. When we arrived at Besançon, they had effected their retreat. The King of Naples followed them. He came up with them and attacked them at Ostrano. He charged them some leagues further on and routed all their rear guard. The following is his report, which I insert because it is characteristic of the manner of this prince, who deserved to die only on the field of battle. I ordered the 1st Corps of the Reserve of Cavalry and 2 battalions of light infantry to advance. They were followed by Delzon's division. We came up with the enemy's rear guard about 2 leagues from Ostrano. It was advantageously posted behind a deep ravine with a great mass of artillery and having its front and flanks covered by thick woods. A little firing took place on both sides. I sent the battalions to check the enemy's infantry who were repulsing our hussars. Delzon's division arrived, and the cavalry had nothing farther to do. The viceroy made his arrangements, and we marched upon the enemy and crossed the ravine. The foreign cavalry, which lined the bank of the Dwina, protected our left and debouched in the plain. The rest of the light troops advanced along the high road in proportion as the enemy's infantry retrograded. The cuirassiers were left in reserve behind the ravine, and the batteries were mounted. My right was covered by immense woods, and I had numerous parties of pioneers. The enemy was driven to the 2nd position in the rear of the ravine, where the reserve was stationed. He brought us back into the ravine, and he was again repulsed. He drove us back a 2nd time, and was on the point of taking our guns, which had got entangled in a defile, through which they were passing in order to take a position on the heights. Our left was repulsed, and the enemy made a bold movement on our right. The foreign brigade was on the point of being dispersed. In this state of things, nothing but a charge of cavalry could enable us to recover ourselves. I attempted it. We advanced to meet the enemy's infantry, which was marching boldly along the plain. The brave Poles rushed on the Russian battalions. Not a man escaped. Not a single prisoner was made. All were killed. Not even the wood protected them from the sabers of our cavalry. At the same time, the squares were broken by the charge. General Girardin, who was leading the battalions on the left, made a movement on the right and advanced along the high road on the enemy's rear. The troops on the right performed the same maneuver. General Perret supported them. He charged at the head of the 8th Hussars. The enemy was routed and owed his safety only to the ravines which retarded our advance. The whole division followed the movement. The infantry advanced along the high road and the cavalry debouched on the heights. I gave orders for firing on 5 or 6 cavalry regiments that were before us. In this situation, Your Majesty came up with me. You ordered me to pursue the enemy, and I drove him to a league and a half beyond Vitebsk. Such, sir, is the narrative of our late engagement with the Russians. The enemy has had about 3,000 killed and a great number wounded. We have scarcely lost a man. This result was, in a great measure, the work of Count Belliard, who on this occasion gave new proofs of his devotedness and courage. To him we are indebted for the preservation of the artillery of Delzen's division. Fatigue and even lassitude have, in the long run, the effect of inspiring courage. Barclay experienced this. He several times entertained the design of risking the fate of a battle, but a foreboding of defeat constantly possessed him at the sight of our troops. Whenever he found them within sight, he hurried his retreat. He beheld without concern his magazines, his guns, and his works fall into our hands. He had but one object in view, which was to keep constantly a few leagues in advance of us. Bagration imitated this example, but he occasionally evinced resolution. He had several engagements with our advance guard. Marshal de Vast pursued him vigorously, but the King of Westphalia advanced but slowly. A dispute arose between this sovereign and Vandamme, and in consequence the orders were not executed. This circumstance saved the Russian prince. He gained ground, reached Mohyloff, and was beaten. He certainly would have fared worse, but for the dispute between Vandamme and the King of Westphalia, which Napoleon, of course, could not foresee. The Russians, who were dispersed along the banks of the Niemen, combined their forces on the shores of the Borysthens. They were preparing for the defense, and we for the attack of Smolensko.
Chapter 26.
I had left Dantzic, and I traversed Lithuania. The country was dreary. It was made up of woods and steeps, an unlimited picture of poverty and desolation. It was at that season of the year when nature displays her riches, yet vegetation was weak and drooping. Everything in those fatal countries depicted wretchedness. Everything foretold the disasters which were to overwhelm us. The rain still continued. The roads were broken up and impassable. The men were losing themselves in the mud and perishing from fatigue and hunger. 10,000 horses lay lifeless on the ground that we had gone over within these 2 days. Never had such a frightful mortality before signalized the commencement of a campaign. Our soldiers, continually sliding on the clayey ground, were exhausted in fruitless exertions. Most of them were unable to keep up. They lagged behind. The Allied troops especially had a prodigious number in arrear. It was easy to foresee that the issue of the war would be disastrous. We had in our favor force and courage, but nature took part with them. We were to fall. However, I arrived at Wilna. I found there the Duc de Bassano, whose prognostics were less gloomy, General Hogendorp, Napoleon's aide-de-camp, with whom I was yet unacquainted, and General Jomini, who afterwards deserted our colors. All augured better than myself of the struggle in which we were engaged. It presented itself, indeed, under specious auspices. All Poland was in motion. Men, women, peasants, citizens, gentlemen, all were animated with the most noble enthusiasm. Troops were organizing, administrations were forming, resources were collecting, and the people were preparing themselves to drive oppression beyond the Borysthens. The Diet of Warsaw had opened. The Polish nation, which had so long been beaten by the tempest, thought that it had at last reached a port. No sacrifice seemed too much for it. The speech of the president had excited general acclamations. Everywhere it had been received with joy. I was curious to read it. Monsieur de Bassano gave it me. "It might have been better," he observed, "but still it is tolerable." The emperor would have wished it stronger in facts, and its expressions less tinged with the affectation of learning. It was the energy of the patriot, and not the measured movements of the orator, that was necessary in so serious a juncture. Nevertheless, it produced its effect. For a long time, there had existed in the center of Europe a celebrated nation, mistress of an extensive and fruitful country, brilliant with the double glory of war and arts, protecting for ages, with an unwearied arm, the barriers of Europe against the barbarians who raged around its frontiers. A numerous people prospered in this land. Nature repaid their labors with liberality. Often had her kings taken a place in history by the side of those who had most honored the supreme rank. This country is Poland. You are that people. But what are you become? How has the dilaceration of our country been effected? How has this family, which even when it was divided did not separate, which had remained united through ages of divisions, How has this powerful family seen itself dismembered? What have been its crimes? Who its judges? By what right has it been attacked, invaded, effaced from the list of states and nations? Whence have the oppressors come? Whence the chains? The indignant universe would answer us. Every state, every people would tell us that it thought that it saw its tomb open by the side of that of Poland, and that in the audacious profanation of the laws on which all societies alike repose, in the insulting contempt which was manifested for them to accomplish our ruin, the world might think itself put in subjection to the temporary purposes of monarchs, and that now it would have no other law. Europe, alarmed and threatened, would point out to our just resentment the empire which, while it caressed us, was particularly preparing to press upon her with an increased force. It is Russia that is the author of all our evils. Within a century, she advances with gigantic stride towards a people who before were ignorant of her name. Poland perceived immediately the first effects of this increase of the Russian power. Placed in her immediate vicinity, she received her first as her last blows. Who could enumerate them from the time when, in 1717, Russia tried her influence by the disbanding of the Polish army? Since that epoch, what moment has been exempt from her influence or her outrages? If this crafty power joined herself to Poland, it is to impose on her, as in 1764, that fatal guarantee which made the integrity of our frontiers dependent on the perpetuation of anarchy, to make that anarchy the means of accomplishing her ambitious designs. The world knows what they have been since that unlucky epoch. It is since then that, by partition after partition, Poland has been seen completely to disappear, without crime and without vengeance. It is since that time that the Poles have heard with indignation the insulting language of the Repnins, of the Sivers. It is since then that the Russian soldier bathed himself in the blood of their fellow citizens, as a prelude to that forever execrable day, must we recall it, in which, in the midst of the shouts of a savage conqueror, Warsaw heard the cries of the population of Prague, which was destroyed by fire and murder. Pole, for it is time to make that name, which we should never lose, resound in your ears. These are the hateful means by which Russia has succeeded in appropriating to herself our fine provinces. These are the claim, the only claim, she possesses on us. Force alone could enchain us. Force may also break the fetters which she alone has forged. These fetters shall be broken. Poland, then, shall exist. What do we say? She exists already, or rather she has never ceased to exist. How can the perfidy, the plots, the violence under which she has fallen, how can they have affected her right? Yes, we are still Poland. We are so by the title that we hold from nature, from society, from our ancestors, from those sacred titles which the universe recognizes and which form the safeguard of mankind. I was carried away by enthusiasm. I had so often seen the brave Polish legions in Italy, in Egypt, and elsewhere. They were right indeed. They were still Poland. In point of courage, I said to the Duke, nothing will surprise me on the part of this brave people, but I own I did not suspect it of this sort of talent. You are right, replied Monsieur de Bassano. They have plenty of other things to do than to make harangues. Who, then, is the writer? The Abbé. What Abbé? Do you think the emperor has a predilection for churchmen? No, but in fine, at the present time, it is not without powerful considerations that an embassy is confided to a priest. Is it the archbishop? The very man. We have sent him to Warsaw to intoxicate the Poles by his eloquence. I do not think him very skillful in business, but he is entirely devoted to the emperor. That is the main affair. His enemies accuse him of being ambitious and restless, without steadiness in his affections, or in his ideas of praising white and black, of being the mere creature of circumstance. I believe this picture a caricature. I myself am persuaded that if events compromise the glory of our arms, he will not be seen among the ranks of our detractors. I firmly believe it. He has abused the Cossacks too much ever to become their patriarch. The deputation of the Diet was still at Wilna. I was acquainted with a few of the members. I saw them. They talked to me of their hopes, of their means, of their rights. These ideas struck me. I gave an account of them to the Duke. You are admirable, said he in reply. What? Do you not recognize the Archbishop? Do you not see with what art he betrays himself? And these biblical reminiscences, To whom would you have them occur but to a priest? Besides, I will give you the document. Sire, the Diet of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, assembled at the approach of the powerful armies of your Majesty, recognized at the outset that it had rights to reclaim and duties to fulfill. With an unanimous voice, it has constituted itself a general confederation of Poland. It has declared the Kingdom of Poland re-established in its rights, and at the same time that the acts of usurpation and arbitrary power by which its existence had been destroyed were null and of no effect. Sire, your Majesty labors for posterity and for history. If Europe cannot mistake our rights, she can still much less mistake our duties. A free and independent nation, since the remotest times, we have not lost our territory and our independence, either by treaties or by conquest, but by perfidy and treachery. Treachery has never constituted rights. We have seen our last king dragged away to St. Petersburg, where he perished, and our nation torn to shreds by princes with whom we were not at war and by whom we have not been conquered. Our rights appear thus evident to the eyes of God and men. We Poles, we have the right to re-establish the throne of the Jagiellons and Sobieskis, to reassert our national independence, to reassemble our divided members, to arm ourselves in defense of our native country, and to prove, by fighting in its defense, that we are the worthy descendants of our ancestors. Can your Majesty disown us or blame us for having done that which our duty as Poles demanded of us, and for having resumed our rights? Yes, sire. Poland is proclaimed from this day. She exists by the laws of equity, but she ought to exist in fact. Right and justice proclaim our resolution to be legitimate, but it ought to be supported on our part. Has not God punished Poland enough for its divisions? Will he perpetuate our misfortunes? And must the Poles, after having cherished the love of their country, go down to the tomb wretched and without hope? No, sire. You have been sent by Providence. Power is placed in the hands of your Majesty, and the existence of the Grand Duchy is due to the power of your arms. Say, sire, let the Kingdom of Poland exist, and the decree will be to the world equivalent to the reality. We are 16 millions of Poles, among whom there is not one whose blood, arms, and fortune are not devoted to your Majesty. Every sacrifice will appear to us light if it has for its object the re-establishment of our native country. From the Dwina to the Dniester, from the Borysthenes to the Oder, one word only from your Majesty will command every arm, every effort, every heart. This unexampled war, which Russia has dared to declare, notwithstanding the recollections of Austerlitz, Pultusk, Eylau, Friedland, in spite of the oaths taken at Tilsit and at Erfurt, is, we have no doubt, an effect of Providence, which, moved by the misfortunes of our nation, has determined to bring them to a termination. The Second Polish War has only just begun, and already we pay our homage to your Majesty in the capital of the Jagiellons. Already are the eagles of your Majesty on the Dwina, and the armies of Russia, separated, divided, cut up, wander in uncertainty, and seek in vain to unite and to form themselves, etc. It is well, yes, undoubtedly, but he is so enchanted with the chef d'oeuvre that he would think himself wanting to his glory if he did not publish to the world that his genius protects Poland. 20 times a day I am obliged to moderate these excesses of self-love. This very morning I have been remonstrating with him on the impropriety of his freaks of vanity. He Ossianizes. Do you recollect the word? It describes him admirably. But now, if his style goes well, his embassy scarcely moves. But for Duroc, who covers him with his wing, I would have already sent him to his flocks. What the devil has the almonership in common with embassies? Why should he put himself to the trouble of so much exertion to do nothing of any possible use?
Chapter 27.
I resumed my route. It was through forests, steeps, everything that is most wild in nature. But I met at every step officers who were going on missions. They gave me news of my friends, of the army. I forgot the scenes that I was passing through. I discussed the probable chances of the war. They talked to me of the valor of the troops, of the prodigious activity of the emperor. It was indeed inconceivable, the movements, the administrations, the measures of security and precaution. He embraced everything. He was equal to everything. The instructions that were given to Monsieur Hautpoult are an example of it. They merit preservation. The orderly officer de Hautpoult will go to Ostrauno, and from thence to Besenkovici. He will see at Ostrauno whether the village is inhabited and whether it has an engineer to reorganize it. He will see at Besenkovici whether the bridges are erected, and if a bridge of rafts has been substituted for the fixed one, which would not stand the first swelling of the river. He will see whether the tête du pont is in progress. He will see also the hospital, the workhouse, the magazines, and in fine, if the country begins to be reorganized. He will give me an account of the troops that he may meet, whether cavalry, artillery, or military equipages. He will see at Besenkowici the 4th Regiment of the Chasseurs of the Guard, and the battalion of Hesse-Darmstadt, which I have commanded to remain there till farther orders. There should also be there several pieces of artillery. He must take care that everything be in its proper position, and that the works at the Tête du Pont be proceeded with in order to finish it. He will inform himself if there are any news of the Cossacks, and, if it is necessary, he will remain one day at Besenkovici in order to see everything, and draw up his dispatch. He will write to me from that quarter, taking care to send his letter by the first estafette that may pass through Besenkovici. He will continue his road to Polosk, from whence he will send me his second dispatch. He will see the functionaries of the town, hospital, and workhouse. He will inform me how many prisoners the Duc de Reggio has taken in the different affairs which have just taken place, how many wounded, all that he can learn on this matter, and on the situation of the Duc de Reggio's corps. The Duc de Tarentum having taken Duneborg, the orderly officer Hautpoult will learn whether the communication between the two corps has been effected. He will get every information which can make me acquainted with the nature of the forces opposed to the Duc de Reggio. He will remain with this marshal, to whom he will send the enclosed letter, till he shall have attacked the enemy, cleared the right bank of the river, and effected his communication with Duneborg, Napoleon. But all this vigilance did not remedy the evil. The soldiers who were unable to keep up with their corps increased visibly. They encumbered our rear. I gave an account to the emperor, whom I joined at the bivouac 3 leagues on this side of Smolensko, of the melancholy picture that I had had incessantly before my eyes during the whole of my journey. It is the effect of long marches. I will strike a great blow, and everyone will rally. You come from Wilna. What is Hogendorp doing? He is wallowing in indolence. Has he not his wife with him? I knew nothing about it. I could not answer. Napoleon replied, if he had his wife, she must go back to France, or at least that he must send her to Germany on the rear. Berthier is going to write to him. Some papers were brought in that had just been translated. Some were the accounts of the victories in which some handfuls of Cossacks had beaten us all. Others were proclamations and addresses, in which we were designated as a troop of missionaries. See, said Napoleon to me, you had no suspicion that we were apostles, but here it is proved that we are coming with damnation for the Russians. These poor Cossacks are going to become idolaters. But here is another of a different kind. Here, read, it is pure Russian. Poor Platov. All are of equal strength in these dreary climates. I read it. It was a long rhapsody with which the Patriarch seasoned a relic of St. Sergius that he offered to the Emperor Alexander. He ended it with this paragraph. The city of Moscow, the first capital of the empire, the New Jerusalem, receives its Christ as a mother in the arms of her zealous sons, and through the mist which is rising, foreseeing the brilliant glory of his power, it sings in transports, Hosanna, blessed be he who cometh. Let the arrogant, the brazen Goliath carry from the borders of France mortal terror to the confines of Russia. Pacific religion, this sling of the Russian David, shall suddenly bow the head of his sanguinary pride. This image of St. Sergius, the ancient defender of the happiness of our country, is offered to your imperial majesty.
Chapter 28.
The affair of Smolensko took place. The battle was obstinate, the cannonade violent. The Russians, taken in flank and enfiladed, were defeated. They could not defend those walls which so many times had witnessed their victories. They evacuated them, but the bridges and public buildings were a prey to the flames. The churches in particular poured out torrents of fire and smoke. The domes, the spires, and the multitude of small towers which arose above the conflagration added to the effect of the picture and produced those ill-defined emotions which are only to be found on the field of battle. We entered the place. It was half consumed, of a barbarous appearance, encumbered with the bodies of the dead and wounded, which the flames had already reached. The spectacle was frightful. What a train is that of glory! We were obliged to turn our views from these scenes of slaughter. The Russians were flying. Our cavalry rushed to the pursuit and soon came up with the rear guard. Korff attempted to make a stand. He was overwhelmed. Barclay came forward with his masses. We, on our side, received reinforcements. The action became terrible. Ney attacked in front, Junot on the flank. The enemy's army would have been cut off if the Duke had pressed forward. Wearied with not seeing him appear, Murat ran to him. "What are you about? Why do you not come on?" "My Westphalians are wavering. I will give them an impetus." The King of Naples put himself at the head of a few squadrons, charged, and overthrew everything that opposed him. "There is thy marshal's staff half gained. Complete the work. The Russians are lost." Junot did not complete it. Whether from fatigue or distrust, the brave of the brave slumbered amidst the sound of the cannon, and the enemy, who were coming up to support their rear, again fell back on their line. The engagement became terrible. The brave Gudin lost his life, and the Russian army escaped us. Napoleon visited the places where the battle had been fought. It was not at the bridge, it is there, at the village, where the 8th Corps ought to have debouched, that the battle hinged. What was Junot doing? The King of Naples endeavored to extenuate his fault. The troops, the obstacles, all the customary commonplaces were employed. Berthier, who had always loved the Duke, interested himself for him. Caulaincourt did the same. Everyone pleaded to the utmost in favor of a brave man who could be reproached with nothing but a moment of forgetfulness. But the advantages we had lost were too great. Napoleon sent for me. "Junot has just lost forever his marshal's staff. I give you the command of the Westphalian Corps. You speak their language, you will show them an example, you will make them fight." I was flattered with this mark of confidence, and expressed my sense of it. But Junot was covered with wounds. He had signalized himself in Syria, in Egypt, everywhere. I begged the emperor to forget a moment's absence of mind on account of 20 years' courage and devotion. He is the cause of the Russian army not having laid down its arms. This affair will, perhaps, hinder me from going to Moscow. Put yourself at the head of the Westphalians." The tone with which he pronounced these last words was already much softened. The services of the old aide-de-camp extenuated the inactivity of the 8th Corps. I resumed, "Your Majesty has just talked to me of Moscow. The army is not in expectation of such an expedition. The glass is full. I must drink it off. I have just received good news. Schwarzenberg is in Wilna. Poland is organizing. I shall have every kind of assistance." I left Napoleon to make known to the Prince of Neuchâtel and the Duc de Vincennes the disgrace with which Junot was threatened. "I am afflicted," said the prince to me, "to see his troops taken from him, but I cannot but own that he has caused the failure of one of the finest operations of the campaign. See on what the success of war depends, on the forgetfulness, on the absence of a moment. You do not seize the occasion in its flight, it disappears and returns no more. No one has more courage or more ability. He adds to the qualities of the soldier the most extensive knowledge. He is intrepid, clever, agreeable, and good-natured. He forgot himself for an hour. He has made himself many enemies. However, I and Caulaincourt will see what is to be done." They managed so well that Junot kept his post. I was very glad of it, first because it saved him from disgrace, and next because I did not much like his troops. Unfortunately, lassitude had succeeded the impetuosity of his youth. He did not show at the Battle of Moscow that elasticity, that energy, of which he had so many times given an example, and the affair of Varaya raised to its height the dissatisfaction of the emperor. We learnt, some days after, the eruption of Tormasov. We were uneasy. We discussed these long points, on the dangers to which one is exposed in advancing to an excessive distance beyond the line of one's operations. Without doubt, Napoleon heard us. He came to us, talked a good deal of the manner in which he had secured the rear, of the corps which formed our wings, and of that chain of posts which extended from the Niemen to our actual position. Tormasov, he said to us, has put all the children at Warsaw in alarm. They saw him already officiating at Prague, but see, he is sent back quicker than he came. He went into his closet and began to dictate with indifference, but loud enough to prevent us losing a word, instructions for the Duc de Belluno. Napoleon to the Major General. Dorogobuj, August 26, 1812. My cousin, write to the Duc de Belluno to go in person to Wilna, in order that he may see there the Duc de Bassano, and inform himself of affairs and the state of things, that I shall be the day after tomorrow at Jasma, that is, 5 days' march from Moscow, that it is possible that, in that situation, communications will be intercepted, that someone then must take the command and act according to circumstances, that I have ordered the 129th Regiment, the Illyrian Regiment, the Westphalian Regiment, which was at Königsberg, and the 2 Saxon regiments to march for Minsk, and that, moreover, I have placed between Minsk and Molau the Dombrowski Division, 12 battalions strong, with a brigade of light cavalry, that it is important for his corps to approach Wilna, and that he must guide himself according to circumstances, in order to be in a condition to support Smolensko, Vitebsk, Mohilo, and Minsk, that the Dombrowski Division ought to be sufficient to keep up the communications from Minsk by Orza as far as Smolensko, since it has only to watch the Russian division of General Hetzel, which is at Mosier, from 6,000 to 8,000 men strong, most of them recruits, and against which, moreover, General Schwarzenberg can act, that the new reinforcements which I shall send to Minsk will also be able to assist against all accidents. And at all events, the movement of the Duc de Belluno to Minsk and Orza, and from thence to Smolensko, appears to me calculated to support our rear, that I have 4 towns and men in garrison at Vitebsk, and as many at Smolensko, that the Duc de Belluno, taking position thus, between the Dnieper and Dwina, can easily communicate with me, will be able quickly to receive my orders, and will find himself in condition to protect the communications from Minsk and from Vitebsk, as well as those from Smolensko to Moscow, that I suppose that General Gouvion St. Cyr has sufficient of the 2nd and 6th Corps to keep in check Wittgenstein, and to have nothing to fear from him, that the Duc de Tarentum can march on Riga and invest the fortress. In fine, that I order the 4 demi-brigades, making 9,000 men who formed part of the Lagrange division, to march for Kauno. That also, it should only be in case General Gouvion St. Cyr should be beaten by General Wittgenstein and obliged to pass the Dwina, that the Duc de Belluno is to march to his support in the first instance, that, this case accepted, he is to follow his course for Smolensko. On this, etc. Signed, Napoleon.
Chapter 29.
The army continued its movements, always driving before it the troops it had defeated at Valentina. Te Deums were often sung in Russia. They are sung for everything in that happy country, but the victories after Tolly's fashion did not calm the anxiety of the nation. She perceived that this mode of conquering would soon drive her into Siberia. She resolved to put her destinies into other hands. Kutuzov drew from the feet of images his military inspirations. He fasted, he prayed, he flattered the priests and the nobility. Heaven could not refuse him its assistance. He was appointed. Admirable in courts, pasquinades are not sufficient on the field of battle. All religious mummeries are of no avail against a good maneuver. He experienced it. The King of Naples, who had a soldier's contempt for amulets, attacks him and cuts his troops to pieces. He wished to make a stand at Cheverino, but the cavalry is put in motion. The charge is sounded. He is overturned and thrown back on his entrenchments. Courage overpowers the saints of Russia. This beginning did not augur well. Heaven answered coldly to the zeal of the Cossacks. Supplications were redoubled. Kutuzov displayed his images. The army defiled before the Virgin of Smolensko, of which we wished to dispossess the devout nation. Prayers, vows, and offerings were made, and the orators of the Kalmucks uttered the following homily. Brethren, you see before you, in this image, the object of your piety, an appeal addressed to heaven that it may unite with men against the tyrant who disturbs the universe. Not content with destroying millions of creatures, images of God, this arch-rebel against all laws, both divine and human, penetrates into our sanctuaries with an armed hand, defiles them with blood, overturns your altars, and exposes the very ark of the Lord, consecrated in this holy image of our church, to the profanations of fortune, of the elements, and of sacrilegious hands. Fear not, then, but that God, whose altars have been thus insulted by this worm which his almighty power has drawn from the dust, will be with us. Fear not that he will refuse to extend his buckler over your ranks and to fight his enemy with the sword of St. Michael. It is in this belief that I wish to fight, conquer, and die, certain that my dying eyes will see victory. Soldiers, do your duty. Think on the sacrifice of your cities in flames, and on your children, who implore your protection. Think on your emperor, your lord, who considers you as the nerve of his power, and tomorrow, before the sun shall have gone down, you will have traced your faith and your fidelity on your country's soil with the blood of the aggressor and his warriors. The sword of St. Michael is undoubtedly a formidable sword, but active soldiers are of still more consequence. Kutuzov did not therefore spare libations. He proportionably increased the fervor of the Cossacks. As for us, we had no inspired men, no preachers, not even subsistence, but we bore the inheritance of a long glory. We were going to decide whether the Tartars or ourselves were to give laws to the world. We were on the confines of Asia, farther than any European army had ever gone. Success was not doubtful. Thus Napoleon saw, with the most lively joy, the processions of Kutuzov. "Good," he observed to me. "They are now busy with pasquinades. They shall not escape us again." He reconnoitered, dispatched orders for moving, and prepared himself for the battle of the morrow. The King of Naples thought these preparations superfluous. He had made himself master of the principal redoubt. The left of this position was turned. He did not believe that the Russians would accept battle. He thought that they would withdraw during the night. This was not their project. They dug, they threw up the earth, they strengthened their position. The next day we perceived them all at work. It was 11 o'clock. Napoleon sent me to reconnoiter. I was charged to approach as near as possible to the enemy's line. I rid myself of my white feathers. I put on a soldier's cloak and examined everything with the greatest care possible. I was only accompanied by one chasseur of the guard. In several places I passed by Russian sentinels. The village of Borodino was only separated from our posts by a narrow but a deep ravine. I advanced too far. They fired at me 2 discharges of grape shot. I withdrew and returned about 2 o'clock. I came and gave an account of everything I had seen. Napoleon was discoursing with the King of Naples and the Prince of Neuchâtel. Murat had entirely changed his opinion. Surprised to see at daybreak the enemy's line unmoved, he had thought action approaching and had prepared for it. Other generals still maintained that the Russians would not dare to run the risk. As for me, I asserted the contrary. I observed that they had plenty of men in a very good position. I was convinced that they would attack us if we did not prevent them. Napoleon did me the honor to be of my opinion, which was also that of Berthier. He called for his horses and made the same reconnaissance in person. He was received as I had been before Borodino. The grape shot obliged him to withdraw. What he saw effectually convinced him that he had not been deceived. On his return, he gave orders in consequence. Night came on. I was in attendance. I slept in Napoleon's tent. The part where he slept was generally separated by a partition of cloth from that which was reserved for the aide-de-camp in attendance. The emperor slept very little. I waked him several times to give him in reports and accounts from the advanced posts, which all proved to him that the Russians expected to be attacked. At 3 in the morning, he called a valet de chambre and made him bring some punch. I had the honor of taking some with him. He asked me if I had slept well. I answered that the nights were already cold, that I had often been awaked. He said, "We shall have an affair today with this famous Kutuzov. You recollect, no doubt, that it was he who commanded at Braunau in the campaign of Austerlitz. He remained 3 weeks in that place, without leaving his chamber once. He did not even get on horseback to see the fortifications. General Bennigsen, though as old, is a more vigorous fellow than he. I do not know why Alexander has not sent this Hanoverian to replace Barclay." He took a glass of punch, read some reports, and added, "Well, Rapp, Do you think that we shall manage our concerns properly today? There is not the least doubt of it, sire. We have exhausted all our resources. We are obliged to conquer. Napoleon continued his discourse and replied, "Fortune is a liberal mistress. I have often said so, and begin to experience it. Your Majesty recollects that you did me the honor to tell me at Smolensk that the glass was full, that it must be drunk off. It is at present the case more than ever. There is no time to lose. The army, moreover, knows its situation. It knows that it can only find provisions at Moscow, and that it has not more than 30 leagues to go. This poor army is much reduced, but what remains of it is good. My guard, besides, is untouched." He sent for Prince Berthier, and transacted business till 5:30. We mounted on horseback. The trumpets sounded, the drums were beaten, and as soon as the troops knew it, there was nothing but acclamations. It is the enthusiasm of Austerlitz. Let the proclamation be read. Soldiers, this is the battle that you have so long wished for. Henceforth, victory depends on you. We want her. She will give us abundance of good winter quarters and a quiet return to our country. Behave yourselves as at Austerlitz, at Friedland, at Witebsk, at Smolensk, and let the remotest posterity quote your conduct on this day, and let it be said of you, he was at that great battle under the walls of Moscow. The acclamations redoubled. The troops were incessantly demanding to fight. The action soon began.
Chapter 30.
The wings were composed of Italians and Poles. Napoleon acted on the left of the enemy's masses. Beyond this, we had no precise information. Women, children, old people, cattle, all had disappeared. There was not a person left who could give us the least information. Ney marched towards the enemy and broke through them with that force, that impetuosity, of which he had given so many proofs. We carried the 3 redoubts which supported the enemy. He came up with fresh troops. Confusion began in our ranks. We gave up 2 of these works. The last even was in danger. The Russians already crowned the crest of the ditches. The King of Naples sees the danger, flies to the spot, alights from his horse, enters, mounts the parapet. He calls and animates the soldiers. The redoubt is strengthened. The fire becomes terrible. The assailants dare not try the assault. Some squadrons appear. Murat mounts his horse, charges, routs the columns scattered over the plain. We retake the retrenchments and finally establish ourselves in them. This trait of boldness decided the fate of the day. General Compans had just been wounded. I went to take the command of his division. It made a part of the corps d'armée of Marshal Davoust. It had already taken one of the entrenched positions of the enemy. It had also suffered much. I consulted, on my arrival, with Marshal Ney, whose right I supported. Our troops were in confusion. We rallied them. We rushed headlong on the Russians. We made them expiate their success. Neither discharges of cannon nor musketry could stop us. The infantry, the cavalry, charged with fury from one extremity of the line to the other. I had never before seen such carnage. We had inclined too much towards the right. The King of Naples remained alone, exposed to the havoc of the batteries of Seminskoye. He had nothing but cavalry. A deep ravine separated him from the village. It was not easy to take it, but it was necessary to do so under pain of being swept away by the grape shot. General Belliard, who only perceives a screen of light cavalry, conceives the design of driving it off and moving by the left on the redoubt. "Run to La Tour-Maubourg," Murat said to him. "Tell him to take a brigade of French and Saxon cuirassiers, to pass the ravine, to put all to the sword, to arrive at full gallop at the back of the redoubt, and to spike all the cannon. If he should fail, let him return in the same direction. You shall place a battery of 40 pieces of cannon and a part of the reserve to protect the retreat." La Tour-Maubourg put himself in movement, routed, dispersed the Russians, and made himself master of the works. Friant came up to occupy them. All the reserve passed and established itself on the left of the village. There remained a last retrenchment, which took us in flank and commanded our position. The reserve had taken one, it thought that it could take another. Caulaincourt advanced and spread far and wide confusion and death. He falls suddenly on the redoubt and gets possession of it. A soldier hidden in an embrasure stretched him dead. He slept the sleep of the brave. He was not a witness of our disasters. Everything was in flight. The fire had ceased. The carnage had paused. General Belliard went to reconnoiter a wood situated at some distance. He perceived the road which converged on us. It was covered with troops and convoys, which were retreating. If they had been intercepted, all the right of the enemy's army had been taken in the segment in which it was placed. He came and informed Murat of it. "Run and give an account of it to the emperor," said the prince. He went, but Napoleon did not think the moment come. "I do not see sufficiently clear on my chessboard. I expect news from Poniatowski. Return, examine, come back." The general returned indeed, but it was too late. The Russian guard was advancing. Infantry, cavalry, all were coming up to renew the attack. The general had only time to collect a few pieces of cannon. Grape shot, and nothing but grape shot," he said to the artillerymen. The firing began. Its effect was terrible. In one instant, the ground was covered with dead. The shattered column was dissipated like a shadow. It did not fire one shot. Its artillery arrived a few moments after. We got possession of it. The battle was gained, but the firing was still terrible. The balls and shots were pouring down by my side. In the space of 1 hour, I was struck 4 times, first with 2 shots rather slightly, then with a bullet on the left arm, which carried away the sleeve of my coat and shirt close to the skin. I was then at the head of the 61st Regiment, which I had known in Upper Egypt. There were a few officers present who were there. It was rather singular to meet here. I soon received a 4th wound. A ball struck me on my left hip and threw me headlong from my horse. It was the 22nd. I was obliged to quit the field of battle. I informed Marshal Ney of it. His troops were mixed with mine. General Desaix, the only general of that division who was not wounded, succeeded me. A moment after he had his arm broken. Friant was not wounded till afterwards. I was dressed by the surgeon of Napoleon, who also came himself to visit me. "Is it then always your turn? How are things going on?" "Sire, I believe that you will be obliged to make your guard charge. I shall take good care not to do so. I do not wish to see it destroyed. I am sure to gain the battle without its taking a part." It did not charge in effect, with the exception of 30 pieces of cannon, which did wonders. The day ended. 50,000 men lay on the field of battle. A multitude of generals were killed and wounded. We had 40 disabled. We made some prisoners, took some pieces of cannon. This result did not compensate for the losses which it had cost us.
This concludes today's reading of the Memoirs of General Rapp, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapters, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.